Minnesota. Seriously. So awkward. They all on the same shape. Wow. Gracias. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, you all. Organizing the movement workshop, where we will, among other things, discuss street actions locally, nationally, and we have the following guests with us this afternoon. We have Solimar Ortiz, Jusino, from the Cuba Solidarity Committee in Puerto Rico. Deputy Director of the Juan Ruiz Rivera Brigade in Puerto Rico, and acclaimed poet and author, author of a couple of writings, Palabras de Conciencia en la Voz del Maestro, and a new book, La Matria en mis pies. You also have Tamara Hansen, coordinator of Vancouver Committee of Solidarity with Cuba, organizer of the International US-Cuba Normalization Committee, one of the organizers of this conference. And author of 5 decades of the Cuban Revolution, the triumph of an unwavering leadership. Also speaking with her is Erin Feely Nahan of the Cuba Sea Coalition and the Saving Lives campaign. Third, we'll have we have Cheryl Lavash, the co-chair of the NNOC-initiated Summer Action, Washington, D.C. And by way of online, we have Isaac Samey, a longtime scholar, activist, former chair of the Canadian Network on Cuba, and author of recently published book, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return. Check out that book. Let's see. First, we're going to have Erin Feely Nahan and Tamara Hansen present for us.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Jason.
Come to the podium.
Okay, I will come to the podium.
I'm just backing her up. I'm just, it's called getting, I got her back.
That's right. Thank you so much, Jason, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, everyone, for your patience today. I know we've been running chronically behind schedule, but it's great to have a full room here for this workshop. We know that throughout this time of pandemic, there's been an acceleration of US attacks on Cuba, especially under the Trump administration. But more recently with the Biden administration, we've seen an unwillingness to roll back the new measures imposed by the Trump administration on Cuba. We've seen an unwillingness to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. And we've seen very, very small and very minimally significant changes made by the Biden administration in terms of access to travel and some issues around remittances with Cuba. But we know that this is not enough. And we know that Cuba has been demanding more, even with the reopening and reestablishment of formal diplomatic ties under the Obama administration. The blockade was still in heavy force against Cuba. And so I think that the most important work that we can be doing today to bring attention of the Biden White House to the criminality of its acts that are continuing towards Cuba is to take to the streets. And that's why I'm so excited that we're here today to talk about street actions. But while Cuba is under attack, I also, of course, we have to talk about Cuba's tremendous leadership in healthcare, in education, in pandemic response, their response to climate change. All of these things provide important examples for things that we can take to folks in the street. Maybe they're not interested in Cuba specifically, but by talking to them about some issues that are facing them and how Cuba has dealt with them, whether again it's education, healthcare, or climate change, we can show how Cuba's example can be an inspiration for folks, and then also make the case for why defending Cuba and defending Cuba against this immoral and cruel blockade is so important. One benefit to COVID-19, a small benefit, but a benefit, is that our Cuba solidarity work has become very different and very exciting. And part of the reason for that is because we've all gotten better at, communicating internationally, whether it's through Zoom, through streaming on Facebook, through social media. We've kind of been forced into a position where a lot of us who are maybe technology hesitant or weren't really sure if it was for us said, well, I have no choice. If I want to connect with these folks, I got to learn this stuff. And it's really built a lot of amazing bridges. And part of that work has been the work happening between Canada and the US, Puerto Rico, Mexico, through the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition. And it's been a real honor to work with Aaron Feely-Naham from the New York, New Jersey, Cuba Sea, and so many other folks throughout this time of pandemic to increase our solidarity, coming together in these conferences, but also organizing so many other actions, including street action. And I would like to suggest further that we have to continue extending these collaborations as the pandemic wanes and the interest maybe in online activities also wanes and we're able to take back to the streets. We need to continue this international connection that we've built through bringing together social justice activists, students, youth, workers, marginalized communities, and all social justice loving people to join us in this campaign against the blockade. Some ways that we can again introduce this idea to new folks, I think, is by having Cubans visit our communities. You can see the power of having the delegates from the Cuban Federation of Women here. And I, of course, recognize that this is easier for us in Canada than it is for folks in the US. But again, Cubans can communicate also through online platforms. There are ways to bring Cuban speakers to your communities virtually, where they can talk about their reality and what it means to be struggling under the blockade in Cuba today. But also trying to bring culture into our work and art and creativity, I think is always so powerful. And of course, we've had some success also with webinars and virtual events talking about everything from the case of George Floyd and why there are no George Floyds in Cuba, to talking about Cuban doctors traveling internationally to fight this pandemic. We've done a lot of really amazing work, and that has also included some 24-hour virtual pickets against the blockade. Most recently, just before the United Nations vote, where the world community came together again to condemn the blockade on Cuba. We saw that we had a mobilization online with 24 hours of film, videos, greetings against the US blockade on Cuba, combined with international street actions. There was a powerful action here in New York outside the United Nations, and smaller street actions that took place in cities around the world, sometimes in front of government buildings, US consulates, US embassies. These things are all really powerful street actions that we can take on that become more significant when we are united on a day of action, because we're not just, 10 people in one city, 15 people in another, 100 in another, but we are a united movement working together. One of the things that I think I want to highlight about these street actions is the Puentes de Amor caravans. These are so important because they are monthly, and some groups are doing caravans where they are in vehicles and driving. Some are having rallies. They're happening consistently on the last Sunday of the month, of every month, that people are taking to the streets against the blockade. Sometimes, again, to hand out the postcards, sometimes to do petitioning, sometimes in cars with signs and raising that awareness against the blockade. But again, these street actions are more powerful when we come together on one date and when we're consistent and creative in our actions. The final thing that I would like to highlight is the work that we are doing with this new postcard campaign that Aaron and I wanted to talk about. So some of you have seen it. It says, "Hey, President Biden, Cuba is not a sponsor of terrorism. Remove Cuba from your list." And the Friends of Cuba Against the US Blockade Vancouver, along with the New York, New Jersey Cuba Sea Coalition, are working to make this a cross-border effort, and in order to try and bring this postcard campaign to folks around the world. And the reason that we think that this postcard campaign is a powerful addition to some of the important work being done by ASEE, being done by the National Network on Cuba, is really because it's something physical that somebody, daily, monthly, weekly can put in the mail, but it's also something where you can take a photo of yourself and share it on social media as you're putting it in the mailbox as an educational part of the campaign. So it has both that kind of physical thing that's a little bit more than an online petition. You can sign it more than once, you can send it more than once, and you can also make it that educational aspect by sharing it on social media. So those are some of the street actions that I've been involved in Vancouver, Canada, and some of the powerful work that I think has come out of this pandemic, where we've really been able to work across borders and find ways to work together, whether it's online or in the streets, or sometimes a mix of both. And I just want to say that I think that we should continue with this work, because if humanity is our homeland, then we know that Cuba is the vanguard of solidarity and humanity. And so we have to make our solidarity work against the blockade our central campaign. So lift the blockade on Cuba. Thank you.
My apologies. I just want to say one quick thing. We have been really grateful to have the Canadians working with us from Vancouver. And since they started, our first attempt to do the international conference was in 2017, and we actually called it a national conference, which was here at Fordham. The Canadians were by our side, and they helped us, and it hadn't gone national really yet at that time. And it was a lot of work, and they were right there. They have been consistently there for us through all of this. So when they asked us, back in December, they started this postcard campaign, which is a good idea and happens also at this time correspond to what the NNOC is doing, what ASEE is doing with the 15th, 16th, and the 17th polls that will be going to Biden's office. And in your street actions, you can take, they brought us some of these postcards, you can take the postcards and hand them out. We can either put them at different events you go to, you can pass them out, take them back, bring them to the post office, put it in bulk, pay for it, or people can take the cards home and mail them from wherever they go. So it is a tool that you can utilize as you're out on demonstrations. So we owe it, I think, to our Canadian friends, because they have helped, and they helped us when we were doing the Saving Lives campaign and the National Network on Cuba. And when we were trying to do the conference and we got stopped because of the pandemic, we didn't really have initially, except for Cheryl. Cheryl is like the master of technology on our side, on the US side, but we were really grateful that the Canadians helped us with all of the technical stuff that us old parts were a little slow in learning, but we're getting better. It's time for us to step up, you know, there's no problem. This is the left arm of the other bird, this bird. So thank you, and support this campaign. We will be giving out postcards. Thanks, Jason, sorry.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Let's see. Next, we're going to hear from Cheryl Labash.
With a little.
Oh, no, she's a.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
It does say you are sharing something, but. Not showing what I want to share. Okay. So much easier if I have two screens. Share again. Select that one. And if you go to slideshow, it'll full screen.
There you go. Well, June 25th is what I think I'm expected to talk about here at our national meeting, our formal meeting. National Network on Cuba focused on taking Cuba off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Today you saw three other co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba in the plenary. And Kala and Shaquille were talking about the campaign itself that is being launched step by step. Right now, it is very much in the outreach phase, the educational phase this month. And going into April, it's going to be more activity. But I don't really want to talk about what's going to happen on June 25th. I'm not going to say, everybody come to Washington because we're going to have the biggest and best demonstration ever to unblock Cuba. I'm not going to say that because, as Tamara explained, things have changed. We've gained and we have also transformed where we do things or we're learning to do things in a different way. What I'm here to do is to ask you not just to come out, but to ask how the force that we have gotten together over the past 3 years, for sure, since the pandemic, but also before that, that the people of the United States do not support the blockade. Increasingly, it's obvious that there is a disconnect on many different levels, on many different issues between the United States government and Washington and the desires of the people of the United States. How do we show it? How do we bring that to life? So it's not just 100, 200, 300, 400, 1,000 people who come out one day and say, unblock Cuba. How do we make it actually felt in Washington? How do they feel? How do we make them feel it? that this is not going to go away, that those postcards are going to keep coming, that all of these call-ins and all of that's going to keep coming. And we're also going to be in Washington. Now, part of it is going to the White House on the 25th of June. That corresponds with the last Sunday caravans that was initiated by Puentes de Amor and the heroic people, Cuban Americans and others in Washington, D.C., who continually go out in the street and say, end the blockade, take Cuba off the list. So the weekend was set up to coincide with that. But in addition, we have resolutions. We have a lot of resolutions. In fact, we just got some unprecedented labor resolutions from the area around San Diego in Southern California. One of the, I don't know if I'm going to be able to actually do it. One of the things I wanted to share was I looked at the map, that we actually have a map that shows all of the cities that have passed resolutions. Some of them have passed more than one. All of the areas that have passed labor resolutions, and the center is really California, where most of it, but Troy, New York, for example, has passed a resolution. And also in Seattle, the Washington Labor Federation, the Coalition of Labor Union Women, APALA, the Alliance of Pacific American Labor Alliance has passed a resolution to end the blockade. And now we have resolutions around the state sponsors of terrorism. We have people in almost every state who are actually activated, that do the caravans, that have committees. What is it? How can we do it? I mean, I've had a number of ideas that have come up over usually driving. And that is, well, let's do an outline of a state and put the resolution. But as Shaquille was talking about this morning, she said that she's recently met with Black farmers. And Black farmers have been to Cuba and they want to trade with Cuba. So can we do some kind of like representation or Congress or something that talks about the healthcare, all the different things that the people in the United States can gain? Do we want to do chalk work? Have a crew that does chalk work at every metro station, every bus stop, every place anybody from Congress can walk, so that they cannot ignore the campaign to get Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism. So what we need is your creativity. We need to hear from you how we can do this. Now, I believe that the international campaign is important. We know that it was Latin America that really was the force behind Biden, along with a number of other things. Fundamentally, it is the people of the United States that have the right and responsibility to confront our government. The government who creates the blockade in our name. So we ask your help. Please log on to a lot of the social media that Kala and Shaquille raised, and we will look forward to you and how you're going to be represented in Washington on June 25th. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Next, we'll hear from Solimar Ortiz, and translating for her is Martine Copel.
Bueno, yo espero que no me vean aquí, esto está. Esto no está hecho para gente de mi estatura.
This is not made for people my size.
Buenas tardes y gracias a todos por estar aquí.
Good afternoon, and thank you for all of you for being here.
Creo que dentro de lo que es la función que ha realizado el Comité de Solidaridad con Cuba en Puerto Rico,
About the work that has been carried out by the Cuba Solidarity Committee in Puerto Rico.
ha sido muy similar a lo que han hecho y se ha replicado a través de todo el mundo, no solamente en América, sino que también en Europa.
It's very similar and replicates the work that's activities that have been carried out around the world, both in the Americas and in Europe.
Sin embargo, quiero destacar que Puerto Rico, por ser esa hermana nación, tenemos un aspecto importante y es que utilizamos nuestra cultura como mecanismo de resistencia.
But there's one thing I wanted to highlight about Puerto Rico, which being a sister nation of Cuba, there is an aspect in which we can use our culture as a weapon of resistance.
No hay un piquete en donde no haya una consigna que tenga pleneros.
We don't have any picket line in Puerto Rico where we don't have pleneros, the Puerto Rican musicians.
Siempre es parte de nuestra consigna la poesía.
Poetry is always a part of our culture, our activities.
Y siempre tenemos la capacidad de utilizar la música como también como mecanismo de protesta.
And we also use music as a mechanism of protest.
Así que somos capaces de crear bohemia contra el bloqueo frente a la Corte Federal. Bohemia contra el bloqueo. Es una bohemia, es música.
Style,
Ajá.
yeah,
Okay.
music.
So we're capable, for example, of doing a bohemia against the blockade. A bohemia is a musical form
Frente a la Corte Federal.
in front of the US federal court.
Recibiendo a los cruceros en el Viejo San Juan.
We receive the big American cruise ships that come into Old San Juan.
Así que tenemos esa posibilidad y un abanico de estilos de protestas en la calle, en donde buscamos más que visibilizar la necesidad de terminar con el bloqueo y darle rostro al bloqueo.
And so we have a whole range of possibilities of different kinds of street protests to not only make visible our presence, but to explain why putting an end to the blockade is necessary.
Es que la gente entienda cómo afecta el bloqueo a la niñez.
To explain how the blockade has an effect on children,
A la mujer,
on women,
al envejeciente
on older people,
y a toda una sociedad
and to the entire society,
que no es muy diferente a lo que nosotros vivimos en Puerto Rico.
which is not very different from what we're living through in Puerto Rico.
Y cada vez que tenemos esa posibilidad de llegar a una persona, abrimos una puerta para una universidad.
And every time we reach a person, we have the possibility of opening doors to a university,
Donde podemos entonces ampliar y educar con relación a cómo afecta el bloqueo y cómo es que nosotros debemos unirnos en solidaridad y amor para con nuestra hermana patria Cuba.
and so that broadens the possibility of explaining how the blockade affects people in Cuba and be able to develop unity and the need for solidarity and love between our two sister nations.
Romper con la propaganda de descrédito y criminalización de la revolución cubana.
To break through the propaganda of slandering and criminalizing the Cuban Revolution.
Es cambiar la perspectiva de lo que es una política sana para un país en donde necesitamos justicia y necesitamos sobre todo libertad en Puerto Rico.
And explain the need to a change in perspective on the healthy policies that we need of justice and freedom in our Puerto Rico.
Y de forma tal que hemos tenido miembros fundadores como Milagros Rivera, que ha tenido la capacidad de trascender en el Caribe y ser miembro fundadora de la red continental de solidaridad con Cuba y todas las causas justas.
And we have one of our founding members of our committee, Milagro Rivera, who has broadened her scope in the Caribbean as one of the leaders of the Continental Network in solidarity with Cuba and other just causes.
Y poder romper la burbuja del Caribe y unirnos como islas caribeñas, porque el bloqueo también nos afecta a nosotros y nos aísla del mundo entero.
And this is part of, it helps us break through the bubble that we are in the Caribbean and the efforts to isolate the different Caribbean nations among themselves. And blockade affects us in that way too.
Seguir rompiendo el bloqueo a través de la brigada Juan Ríos Rivera, seguir llevando puertorriqueños contingentes que siempre va a estar presente en Cuba para dejar saber que Cuba no está sola y que Puerto Rico va y no se detiene.
Work of the Juan Rios Rivera Brigade of taking Puerto Ricans to Cuba to show that Cuba is not alone and that Puerto Ricans keep fighting and will not stop.
Y también cabe resaltar, también tenemos que dejar el lenguaje, dejar saber que embargo no es lo mismo que el bloqueo. Y nosotros también tenemos eso presente en nuestra campaña educativa.
And to highlight the question of language, that embargo is not the same as blockade, and this is part of our educational work.
Que gracias.
Many thanks, Solimar. Thank you, Marty, for translation. Next. Give me 1 second, Allison.
Okay.
Thanks.
Jason. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Next, we're going to hear from Isaac Samey online.
No, that's okay. Isaac, are you there? Can you say hello?
Hi, can you hear me?
Certainly can. Welcome.
It's a pleasure as always. And as I said, it's a pleasure to see so many people online and gathered physically as we continue to demonstrate the growing movement in support of Cuba to end the illegal, criminal, inhumane US economic war against Cuba. The blockade, as we all know, no need to reiterate, has been the principal obstacle to Cuba's social development, and what Cuba's accomplished despite this ongoing economic war has been an inspiration to humanity. What I want to talk to briefly, which segues from what Cheryl Labash was talking about, one of the co-chairs of the NNOC, is initiative coming out of CARICOM. CARICOM is the community of Caribbean states, who are primarily English-speaking colonies, even though formerly English-speaking colonies, though they're expanding. It consists of 15 members with 5 associate members, and Cuba has a very close relationship with CARICOM. When the states were becoming independent, Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados and others, one of the things they did very courageously was to actually establish diplomatic relations with Cuba in 1972. And in fact, in December of this year, December of last year, rather, 2022, there was a major conference commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Caribbean community's relationship with Cuba, which has ever deepened in terms of economic trade relations. Cuba also provides so many medical personnel, so many students have been educated from Caribbean countries, and more importantly, anyone who ever listens to the debates and the interventions when the annual resolution comes up at the United Nations General Assembly condemning the illegal criminal US economic blockade against Cuba, Caribbean countries are among, together with African countries and other Latin American countries, but Caribbean countries are among the most eloquent in condemning the blockade and defending their right to have relations with Cuba, despite pressures from the United States. I think it's important to understand that how incredibly courageous it is for these countries, which normally are dismissed as being of little significance geopolitically and on the international stage. I myself hail from Trinidad and Tobago, where we're often dismissed, our Caribbean islands, as specks on the Caribbean Ocean, who simply exist in the U.S. Great Lake. The U.S. considers the Caribbean Sea its lake as part of its backyard, and are simply there to be pawns to do whatever the United States deems is necessary. The Caribbean nations have stood up in one voice and demonstrated incredible courage time and time again in condemning the economic blockade and calling for it to be lifted, and in continuing to deepen their relations with Cuba. In this context, Barbados has played a very central role. Our Prime Minister Mia Mottley has played an incredible role in voicing her opposition, not only to the blockade, but also in laying down the foundations for a Caribbean continual relations with Cuba. She was central, together with Ralph Gonsalves, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent, who's also been a powerful, eloquent voice, at the CARICOM Summit, CARICOM Cuba Summit that took place in December, in declaring that October 6th will be the CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism, in honor of the 73 individuals who were killed in the terrorist bombing of the civilian Cuban airliner 455, which claimed lives, as I said, of 73 people, but many of them are young people. This was a terrorist act, the first of its kind against a civilian airliner in the Americas. And it was an act that touched not only Barbados, because the explosion occurred off the coast of Barbados. In fact, Ralph Gonsalves, who is current Prime Minister of St. Vincent, was teaching at the KFL campus of the University of West Indies, which is located just outside the capital of Bridgetown. And he himself saw the plane go down. So obviously Barbados, it was directly touched by this horrific crime, this horrific tragedy. The plane itself had taken off from Trinidad and Tobago, where the bomb was planted, and the license of the Cubana captain, right, washed up on the shores of St. Lucia, and in fact is held in a small museum there. So it touched all of these people. It touched Guyana. There were members of Guyana who were young people who were on that plane when it was destroyed. And there's actually in Paynes Bay, Paynes Bay in Barbados, there's a monument, a beautiful monument that was built and then has been refurbished several times to commemorate that horrific tragedy. And there was a ceremony that took place with President Miguel Diaz-Canal, Prime Minister Mottley, Ralph Gonsalves, and other representatives. The President of Guyana, Afan Ali, was there as well, which not only commemorated and marked that horrific tragedy, but as I said, underscored that October 6th will be an event across the Caribbean, a day when in different Caribbean islands, there will be various events organized, specifically not only to commemorate that terrorist act, but to call not only for the United States to lift the U.S. economic blockade, but specifically for the United States to remove Cuba from that spurious, nefarious list, the state sponsors of terrorist list, right? When Cuba itself has been a victim of terrorism. Some of you may have remembered in 1997, the various bombings of Havana hotels that claimed the life of Fabio de Kelmo. He is just one of over 3,400 Cubans that have been killed by terrorist acts, and there's over 2,000 that have been injured by these terrorist acts. So one of the things that was implicit in this, not explicit, because this was a call by CARICOM governments, but was implicit with my discussions when I was there at the CARICOM summit with various Caribbean officials, was that the hope is that this October 6th will become a global day to rally people not only to point out that Cuba has been a victim of terrorism, but specifically at this moment to demand that the Biden administration remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. We all know that's within his immediate power, simply because once he says that should be done, there's a 45-day, if I understand it, Cheryl can correct me, a 45-day review period by the State Department, in which then the decision to remove them from that list can happen. As many of you knew, many of you know, being on that list activates a whole series and levels of additional sanctions and punitive measures, vicious measures that the United United States has used to impose on Cuba, from everything from banning them from access to international financial institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a thing that we can win. We know AMLO, we know, for example, the Colombian president, Pedro, and others have specifically asked Biden to remove Cuba from that list as part and parcel of the struggle to remove the U.S. economic blockade of Cuba. So as part of the action plan of the conference that is proposed from our US-Cuba Normalization Conference is for internationally, but particularly here in Canada and the United States, for us to use October 6th as a rallying moment, right? To demand that Cuba be removed from the state sponsors of terrorist lists, because it's such a poignant moment in the sense that October 6th demonstrates how spurious that claim that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism is, because Cuba has been a victim of complicit and tacit state-sponsored terrorism from the United States. So October 6th is a moment to say not only abajo to the blockade, but also to actually make a concrete and almost immediate demand that the Biden administration can do, a demand that's come from so many Latin American and Caribbean countries. Thank you.
At the end of every month, in conjunction with what's happening that Fuentes del Amor is leading. And another thing that we've been doing is defending a mural. The Dos Alas mural, two birds. It's a mural depicting the image of Che Guevara and Juan Albizu Campos. This mural has been the target of vandalism, 7 incidents over the past almost 2 years now. There's a group based in East Harlem that took the initiative of the Mural Restoration Committee that mobilizes a few of us as quickly as possible. After each and every incident, it's repaired. We have a goal of broadening the campaign outside of the immediate neighborhood. Incidentally, upon each time we repair it, more and more passersby find out about the history of the mural. We get to talk about ending the blockade. People have donated money to help in the repair costs, including many people who will stop and say, well, I don't know if I agree with Fidel or the revolution, but I support artistic freedom. I support the right. Yes, we should have called. The rightists in this case have been kind of pushed back, but we can go even further by just emphasizing the importance of right, of freedom of expression, of democratic expression, including artistic expression, free of harassment. And since the last repair, things continue to remain in order, but we'll be ready. We'll continue to organize even deeply around this. Finally, we have a goal locally of, and hopefully this is the goal nationally, to reach back out to the campuses. The college campuses are now open for in-person activity, and therefore we should take advantage of that. Meeting with the various student groups, student association, Black student unions, Alliance for Latin American organizations, etc. With helping to build this event, we got a pretty good hearing at a couple of campuses locally. including this one, that, one of the chief, people, sets of students who helped, put this conference together. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I thought that was, important to add. And, for Q&A, please keep your remarks as brief as possible, no more than say a minute and a half.
Me ayudan a traducir. A ver, mi nombre es Alicia.
I guess I'm coming.
Her name is Alicia. Oh. No, you go first.
Muy brevemente. Mi nombre es Alicia.
My name is Alicia
Alicia Campos.
Campos.
Y hago parte de la Federación de Mujeres Cubanas.
I'm part of the Cuban Women's Federation.
El nombre, yo quiero transmitirle esto este pequeño mensaje.
But I want to convey this little
En
message
nombre de la Federación de Mujeres Cubanas,
on behalf of the Cuban Women's Federation.
yo coordino
I coordinate
la oficina regional para América y el Caribe de la Federación Democrática Internacional de Mujeres.
I coordinate the regional office for Latin American and Caribbean of the International Democratic Women's Movement.
Eso me permite, entre muchas otras cosas y mucho trabajo,
It's a lot of work, but it allows me, among other things,
tener vínculo con los movimientos de solidaridad de América y del mundo.
it allows me to have ties to the solidarity movement in the Americas and around the world.
Por eso yo quiero reconocer
So I want to
la
recognize
fuerza del movimiento de solidaridad con Cuba que hay en Estados Unidos.
the importance and strength of the or the power of the Cuba solidarity movement in the
Y lo
United
digo
States.
con conocimiento de causa
I know it from my knowledge
porque interactúo con muchos movimientos de solidaridad en el mundo
because I interact with many solidarity movements in the world.
y hay una fuerza y hay un compromiso y hay un apego en el pueblo de Estados Unidos con la causa de Cuba que es impresionante y que nos llena de regocijo.
Because there is a force, an international force, and commitment that I find among the people of the United States with the cause of Cuba that is impressive and
Por supuesto, reconocer a Canadá,
of course,
reconocer a nuestro hermano del Caribe de Puerto Rico,
we want to recognize the work done in Canada, the work of our compañeros and compañeras in Puerto Rico.
y me tomo el atrevimiento de pedir en nombre del pueblo de Cuba
And I take the liberty of speaking on behalf of the people of Cuba,
que toda la solidaridad siempre no va a ser suficiente. Necesitamos mucha más.
that all the solidarity we have received is not enough. We'll need
Mucha
a lot
más
more,
acciones.
many more actions.
Porque el pueblo de Cuba está dando la batalla.
Because the people of Cuba are in the battle.
Porque el pueblo de Cuba está resistiendo.
People of Cuba are resisting.
Porque el pueblo de Cuba sabe que con el socialismo mejor es posible.
The Cuban people know that with socialism, better is possible.
Y porque el pueblo de Cuba va a mantener y a defender su revolución por encima de cualquier cosa.
And because the Cuban people will defend and maintain their fight for socialism no matter what.
Así que muchísimas gracias en nombre de todos mis compañeros.
Thank you, thank you.
Nos tenemos que ir. Chao.
Can I be so bold as to just add one thing?
Ayer nos reunimos con la National.
So, muchas gracias a la compañera. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much. I just wanted to come back. It wasn't asked as a question, but I think it's a question that's been raised actually just through the speakers today. Another thing is that with all the successes of our Cuba Solidarity movement over this time of kind of the last 3 years of pandemic, we also have come under attack. And, it was brought up really well by Jason about the Dos Alas mural here in New York City, that right-wing forces are working to destroy that. We know that our friends with the Juan Rius Rivera Brigade, Puerto Rico, have had their doors knocked on by the FBI, trying to intimidate people out of traveling to Cuba from Puerto Rico. We know that the Miami car caravan was attacked this month, has been attacked previously, but this time more violently and more organized, and more frightening for those participating in Miami, known already as a very challenging city to do any sort of Cuba solidarity work. And so I think this is also a good time to discuss how we defend ourselves, how we defend our right to freedom of expression, our right to freedom of speech, our right to defend Cuba, and how we do that in the streets. And I know today at the conference also folks were working on security, and there was some intense situations with some right-wing folks who showed up to protest today's conference. And so these are things that our movement is also facing that I think shouldn't intimidate us, because I think that overall our work is safe and our work is generally legal, but we have to defend our space. When our space comes under attack, we have an obligation to defend it when they want to take away our feelings of the right to protest, the right to express ourselves freely. And so I think that's also a good point if anyone wants to touch on that today in discussion.
Yeah. Also, may I be able to say something? This is Isaac here. Can you hear me?
Isaac, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to follow on this issue. Obviously, I was speaking about CARICOM, the Caribbean community, and I have roots there, but I'm based obviously in Canada and was, as people know, a former co-chair of the Canadian Network on Cuba. People often take Canada-Cuba relations, Ottawa-Havana relations, as in a sense, given that somehow it's obviously people talk about the kind of engagement that Canada has with Cuba, the free travel and so forth, and that in a sense, this is something we take for granted. I should point out there has been a concerted attack that's been carried on Canada-Cuba relations. And we've heard that there are certain people in Canadian decision-making ruling circles who would like, in a sense, to rupture relations with Cuba, at least move closer to mirror what Washington's relations are. The way this current attack is taking place is on trying to discourage Canadians and in fact to attack tourism to Cuba that comes from Canada. As many of you probably know, Canada is, before COVID, was the single largest source of tourists to Cuba. Over 1 million people would visit, and now that is actually beginning to increase as time goes on. More and more Canadians in the so-called, if we may call ourselves in a post-COVID era, that can be debated, but in the post-COVID, are now traveling to Cuba and so forth. And there's been a series of articles that have appeared in the Canadian press, particularly in the CBC, which is a sort of like our main media outlet, basically attacking Cuba. There was a scurrilous article that talked about Cubans fleeing Cuba and that any Canadian tourist who goes there is therefore complicit, with the usual disinformation and negatively based images. The Canada-Cuba Solidarity Movement, among others, have responded very powerfully to that kind of slander against Cuba and so forth. But also there is an attempt to basically also single out the foreign investment that's coming from Canada. Canada, aside from being the single largest source of tourists to Cuba, is also the single largest source of foreign investment. So one of the things that we are very, very concerned about as Canada increasingly becomes integrated into, may I say, the military-industrial complex, the war-making machinery of the United States, is increasingly parroting and mirroring U.S. foreign policy. There is a tremendous wellspring of support for Cuba among Canadians, right? And so that's the problem they face, right? So they've begun this sort of, shall we say, low-intensity warfare through the media to undermine Cuba's prestige and the affinity that Canadians have for Cuba and so forth. So this is one thing we have to also be very careful about. Canada has been specifically targeted, at least Canadian relations, and there are accomplices within the Canadian ruling class who would like to carry this out.
Okay, thank you, Isaac. We have a special guest here, Dwayne Stillwell, but before he comes up, just out of courtesy to the audience, just another question, and maybe when he comes up and presents, we can sort of, take, or, one of the other guests.
We need to wrap up by 6 o'clock. So I think this gentleman, is important he speaks because he was also helping out with security today.
Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead.
I just wanted to reaffirm the importance of taking defense seriously and not being because as crisis, the capitalist crisis increases, movements like ours will be attacked, yeah, and taking it seriously, defense and the importance of that. So I just wanted to.
Thank you, brother. Yes.
Should I get up or?
Sure.
Oh, if you want, it's up to you.
You got that timer? Okay, so I'm gonna make it very brief. Last year, my son's uncle was killed in a work-related accident. A year before that, my mother was killed in an accident. A year before that, I had a daughter who I loved since she was a little girl killed. Right now, I'm working on changing my name because I received my Taino name in the proper indigenous traditional way. The Supreme Court in the Bronx lost my envelope, lost my birth certificate. Over the last 7 years, my family has been hunted and persecuted in every way you have ever heard about in any movie and in any documentary and any conference you've ever attended. And even today, as I work with my brothers out front to keep things cool, people was getting in my face and surrounding me. And you might ask, why the heck am I here? Son, raise your hand. This young man came to live with me in New York City at Brother Shepcat's home, who gave us a safe space just for a little while until ACS came knocking on the door saying, this boy can't live here. And put me in a position where my only choice was to go into PATS and go into shelter. And after all those investigations ACS did to try to stop me from doing a revolutionary home education curriculum with my children, after both of my daughters left our family because they were scared for their mothers, I'm still here because of love. Because I love that boy. And until the moment they come and take me, my rights and my people, my rights and my family, and my love for God is going to keep me going. Thank you. There you go. That was.
Yes. You can come up or you can stay. It's up to you.
Well, my question is, how do we wake up activists in the US to what their primary objective has to be? Because the best thing that we can do for Cuba is to stop capitalism and imperialism in the United States. And that means that we who are aware of these issues, we have to do extensive on the ground work, talking to the members of the working class, helping them understand that they're being oppressed by the same people who are oppressing the Cubans so that they can fight against their oppressors and ultimately create the space for Cuba. Cuba liberated itself, but it can't breathe because we haven't liberated ourselves here. And so how do we shake activists, people who are aware, people who watch these kinds of conferences, how do we shake them out of defeatism and let them know, like, hey, listen, this is a fight to be won and that we have to do it now?
Well, I'll just respond to that briefly, and I'll introduce the brother Dwayne here. Reminds me of something Malcolm X once said. Know what's going on, particularly people who go to conferences, but even many people who don't go to conferences, many average everyday people on the street. They know what's going on. What we don't know of initially, as Malcolm put it, is our self-worth, our worth, and our ability to change society and in the process transform ourselves. And that comes through the various struggles, whether it's a fight against police brutality, whether it's a strike at work, whether it's speaking out at school against teachers saying historically biased things, starting with where people are at, not where we might want them to be, but where they're at. That's my 2 cents. Brother Dwayne Stillwell, please.
Thank you. This is a great discussion. First, I want to just tell you, let's see if you can remember, right? Miami Caravan Against the Blockade at gmail.com. I'll repeat it, Miami Caravan Against the Blockade at gmail.com. I have flyers for anybody who wants. They're organizing a defense of the people of the United States to exercise their First Amendment rights. protest against anything, any redress of grievances, right, against the United States. The Miami caravan has recently come under increasing attacks by the right wing in Cuba. I'm sorry, in Miami, which often has right wing Cubans, of course. But I just want to tell you that in Miami, there's an organized effort right now to defend those democratic rights. And you can read all about it if you want to come back and get this flyer. They're getting the runaround from the city attorneys, from the police department. They're being pushed off of the sites where they have permits to do their caravans or their events. And the police usually favor the right wing over the protest against the blockade of Cuba. So it's important for us to be aware of this. It is intense in Miami, but it's happening around the world. And just to add my 2 cents to what the brother was talking about, the way to let people know what's going on, if they don't already know, is to link foreign policy of the United States with domestic policy. Because if you want to understand what's happening here, how they're busting the unions and preventing Amazon labor union from organizing unions and things like that, you have to know that the biggest lie in the world is the idea that the United States defends democracy. All you have to do is know a little history and know about world history to know they invade countries, they overthrow countries, they go against democratically elected countries, and to claim that they defend democracy is the biggest lie in the world, and that's where you have to start. Show the lies of the US government around the world, then you can begin to understand what's happening here. Malcolm X and Che Guevara were they understood that, and the idea that only through struggle you can transform yourself in that process. If you watch from the sidelines, you don't fight for what's right, you are not going to transform yourself into a real fighter for social justice, and we all have to do that. So thank you very much for giving me the time, and get the flyer, find out what's happening, and fight for democratic rights here, because that defends Cuba as well.
But it's 5:56. Fortunately, we have to wrap up. But just before we do that, the sister, please.
Great, great place. Thanks to be in. I just want to answer the brother. What's your name?
Makasi.
Okay. One of the things is telling on what he was saying that no, it's not something that they're impoverished and you have to do is to show all of the real things that happened that was resistance and that we won. And so people learn how to do that. The other thing is that to add on is that in the 60s, we knew the schools weren't teaching our children what they need to learn. So we had Friday night teachings or Saturday or Sunday, where you could get the community to come in, and the children and the parents are learning about the resistance. Because people know, you don't have to say somebody doesn't have a place to sleep. You don't have to tell them that you don't have a place to sleep. You have to say, how do I get off the street and get the houses? Maybe I'm going to take over some of these big old glass houses that they're just building for themselves. So it's just to look back at that. I mean, one of the things is that there's so many people in our past whose shoulders we're standing on, and they knew what they had to do, and they did it.
Thank you very much, sister. I think that is a good note for us to end on. I'll just say, do not leave this conference without making a point to participate in the next local anti-embargo rally, whether it's here in New York, DC, wherever you might live. Take some flyers, information to some campuses, to your neighbor, to your coworkers. Whatever struggles going on at work, think about how you can, get the people around you, the people you go to church with, cetera, involved in the fight to end the blockade against Cuba. Not everybody's going to agree on every issue at the start. That's not the goal. But to start with where we're at and broaden our scope, and be patient with people to do the same. That's what activists need to do. Patience, I think. We're with each other. Listen and patience. On that note, you can always discuss more informally. Please come to the Malcolm X Betty Shabazz Center, 3940 Broadway, for the second part of today's conference.
We're back here tomorrow at 11 to talk about the action plan. If you have any, we'd love to have your perspective.
Yes, indeed.
Whoa,
Thanks again to our speakers. The other has to leave already. That's Tamara. Thank you. And Cheryl. Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Isaac.
Thank you. Good work.
It should be open upstairs, yeah. I can't quite remember. I feel like. Might be on the- I really. This is a letter. Yeah. So much to look at. You know, I'll look
Stream it, and it might be something that end up like.
Rojas, Iris Coder, Iris Rodriguez. Love the program. We appreciate you, Max. All right. There will be live stream Betty Shabazz Center. We hope to see you. Hasta pronto. Viva Fordham.
City Fox. Hang at